first of all, just to introduce the panel. It's one of those occasions where I think, you know, there's probably not much introduction needed on the one hand. If I did a full introduction, we'd probably take up the whole of the session just going through the list of positions and publications of the panel. So I'm trying to do a halfway house here. Pardon?
I said we are not here for
No. Yes. No. But just very briefly, let me begin. First of all, we have David Chandler, who's a Professor of International Relations and Director of the Centre for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster, and also editor of the journal Resilience, International Policies, Practices and Discourses. We also have Heidi Hudson, who's at the end there, who is Professor of International Relations and Director of the Centre for Africa Studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa. She's also a Global Fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo and co-editor of the International Feminist Journal of Politics. Then next we have John Paul Lederach, who I'm sure you're all familiar with from today, but just to recap, he is Professor of International Peace Building and Director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the University of Notre Dame, as well as being Distinguished Scholar at the Eastern Mennonite University. The next one is Oliver Richmond, who is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Unit at the University of Manchester. Oliver edits the Palgrave book series Rethinking Peace and Conflict Studies, and is also co-editor of the journal Peace Building. And finally, but by no means least, is Tom Woodhouse, who certainly people from Bradford will be familiar with, who is Emeritus Professor in the Division of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford, and amongst many, a whole range of publications and stuff that he's produced. I guess he is co-editor of the hugely influential edited book Contemporary Conflict Resolution, which I think is one of the definitive publications in that particular field. So in short, we have a panel that I think consists of some of the most significant and influential thinkers on the issues of peace and conflict today. I would also say as well, for those young and upcoming researchers who've presented papers at the conference, we also seem to have more journal and book series editors than you can shake a stick at. So this is your opportunity to get hold of them at the end of the session and suggest why they should be publishing your papers. Okay, the title of this plenary session is Between Realism and Critical Security Studies. What is the continued relevance of peace studies? And the format that we're going to operate with is, given that we've got a large panel, and I want to try and keep some time for questions and answers at the end, I've asked the panelists to keep their initial points to 10 minutes, to speak for the first 10 minutes, so that we do have time for questions at the end. Just a final point to note is that Heidi is going to go first, and part of the reason for that is because she does have to leave to get a plane early. So if you see her dashing off midway through somebody else's point, it's not that she's leaving in high dudgeon and has taken offence, it's just that she has to take a plane. Okay, I was going to make some preliminary comments about the theme, but I think given the time constraints and given the eminence of the panel as well, I think it is far more appropriate for us to just go to the first presentation from Heidi Hudson.
Well, thank you very much, colleagues, and Professor Neil Cooper for inviting me to be on this panel, and also to Professor David Francis for making this trip possible. It's wonderful hospitality to be here with you. Ladies and gentlemen, I will address these questions that Neil posed to us in a roundabout way by drawing on my own insight and experience of other interdisciplines, such as feminist studies and African studies. And you are welcome to send me hate mail afterwards, because I will probably not be part of the Q&A, and I'll do my best not to respond to it. When I told one of my UK colleagues that I'm going to be on this roundtable, he remarked that talking about peace sounds terrible, especially in such a violent world. And as we all know, the world changes, but as it changes, it stays the same. And that third-party military intervention for humanitarian purposes seems less likely by the day. And that maybe retreat is possibly the best, seems like the best option on both sides of the Atlantic, despite the rhetoric of support for responsibility to protect issues. So geopolitics is back, or maybe we can say it's never left the building. If we can believe what Robert D. Kaplan recently wrote in the Time magazine, talking about how Western leaders have kidded themselves to believe that we are all, that we have a consensus about certain global values and universal values, only to find out that there are many leaders in other parts of the world who actually have kept on playing territorial politics all along. Now, I see that the challenges for peace studies are threefold, and these are not terribly original. It relates to the issues of conceptual, empirical, and normative issues. When I was asked to say a few things about the future of peace studies and the continued relevance of peace studies, I quickly went back and read a little bit about peace studies, because peace informs my work, but I don't teach peace studies. And I was a bit disappointed, because I saw the familiar stuff of the stuff that I taught 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So maybe you can say to me, I didn't do my research properly. That's a possibility. But the other possibility is that peace studies actually hasn't moved on yet. And it makes this conference then deeply, deeply significant. I would say that I don't think that there's been a rigorous and systematic and thorough engagement with the issues, especially after the Cold War. So now I'd like to talk about the importance of having a plurality of discourses and peace theories and methodologies and an open-ended ontology. But before I can talk about that, I need to look at critical security studies, the elephant in the room. And I want to talk about the hegemony of discourse, big D, and the allure of new materialities. And I highlight the limitations of critical security studies for a specific reason, in order to argue that there's a gap for us as peace studies scholars to step in and reassert and reinvent our emancipatory agenda. The discursive turn in critical security studies certainly hasn't done many people a favor, because I think it led to more camps and even more binaries. In my own discipline, or interdiscipline, feminist security studies, we've seen a bifurcation between security studies scholars, the feminists, looking at gender discursive constructions of violence and theorizing the body, but with very little attention to economic insecurities. And on the other hand, feminist global political economy scholars shying away from the security frame and its discursive implications, and then looking more at capitalism and economic globalization. The implication with this emphasis on discourse is that gender, for instance, as a social relation of inequality, is grossly neglected. Now, I want to play devil's advocate here and say I don't think that all this emphasis on discourse is actually, and the theorizing about the body and entanglements and subjectivities make one bit of difference to the everyday struggles of women and men in post-colonial Africa or post-liberal Africa. In the context of a feminist concern for the role of social situatedness in the production of knowledge, I think this can sometimes be seen as self-indulgent luxuries reserved for ivory tower elites, satisfying their intellectual fetishes. And so there's the hate mail coming. I can feel it coming. But don't get me wrong, post-structuralist approaches do have a place. It helps us to see when a discourse becomes dominant or not, and so forth. But I think in this relationship, discourse and materiality remains the Cinderella. It's always discourse determines materiality. It's not an equal relationship. And I mention this because I think that peace studies need to step into that debate and have a say about that as well. Which brings me to the issue of new materialities. This hype about the new materialities and how we're going to look at non-human things, the thingification, and what that means for assigning agency to non-human actants. I think it's a little bit too early to say what impact this new body of research has had on peace. But I would say that maybe the intention of this body of literature is more on depicting connections for the sake of demonstrating complexity rather than a deliberate political project of social science, social change. So there again, it's a gap for peace studies to reconceptualize its agenda. In particular, what is the role of the human? How do we see human in relation to non-human and the bigger ecocentric system? Human for me is something that is close to my heart because it's a notion that was deeply disempowered through the discourse of complementarity between state security and human security. I also, in the face of the proliferation of many of the critical areas, and here I'm referring to the body of literature, critical war studies, critical geopolitics, security studies, critical military studies, I cannot help but wonder if you have to say it. Do you have to call yourself critical? Peace studies has the advantage. We don't have to say we're critical because we've built up a reputation. But that is also the challenge. If you, because the critical in peace studies needs to be cherished. So in the face of this proliferation, I would like to conceptualize the place, the location of peace studies a little bit differently from the way that Neil has phrased it. Not between critical security studies and realism, but maybe at the intersection or the interface of a whole range of critical sub-areas, such as feminist studies, such as security, critical security studies, complexity theory, human security, and so forth. If we see security as the condition for peace as the end goal, then I think peace studies should logically occupy the interstitial space. By that I mean that occupying the interstice means having access to a vast range, and this is where the interdisciplinarity comes in, a vast range of intellectual resources and methodologies with which to subvert and unsettle and challenge. And this kind of positioning, making comments and bringing perspectives from the chinks, the cracks and the crevices to provide particular insights to enrich empirical context and invigorate more parsimonious theories, I think is an opportunity that peace studies should take on. I'm almost getting to the end. The issue of the liberal roots of peace studies. I want to just say a few things about broadening the agenda, the research agenda of peace studies. The history of peace studies, as far as I'm concerned, is the history of modernity. And despite the radical agenda, it has colluded in attempts to control by denying the existence of other worlds with different ontological presuppositions. This denial is called coloniality. And I would say that in the words of Audre Lorde, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Therefore, peace studies need to engage with areas like decoloniality, critical border thinking. Now, critical border thinking for me is critiques from the margins. This is different from where I place peace studies at the interstice. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Two more things just about the research agenda. The topic of the conference is past, present, and future. How do we link the past and the future? As human beings, we don't have the vision to actually see and understand that the misery that we are experiencing currently is not worse than the misery before, but it's actually getting better because we don't have that bigger picture. I think we need to look at, for instance, conflict-ridden African countries which may be written off by Western standards as basket cases. But if you look at the long view, the historical view, one can see that there are certain elements of resilience that keep the past and the future together. It's the glue that keeps things together. Despite crises and disasters, these societies have remained functioning. Maybe not according to Western standards, but according to a particular standard. So resilience is something that we need to theorize as peace study scholars, and also maybe that could lead to different understandings of peace. Last word, privatized peace. I think we need to actually also look at what this means for what kinds of peace we can achieve and what it means to the meaning of security. I think that there's a symbolic and material global rescaling of who controls the means of protection. We need to engage with that. And then if this was not provocative enough, I would suggest, Neil, that you invite me back for the centenary celebrations, but please make sure that there's an oxygen tank and a wheelchair for me.
Okay, next we have Tom Woodhouse.
Working, is it? No? That is. Okay. Thanks very much, Heidi, and thanks, Neil, for setting the panel up. When I read the question embodied in the way in which Neil formulated the topic for the panel, I asked him what he meant by it, really. What was the ideology behind it? What was he really getting at? And he said, well, look, he didn't really mind what we said as long as we were provocative. So Heidi's had her go at that. My approach is similar, and I thought that in looking at the formulation of the topic of the panel, I'd deconstruct it and reverse it a little bit. Slightly mischievously, because what I'm going to suggest, I'm going to speak up for peace studies, and I think it's sometimes we're not positive and assertive enough about what it is we've achieved. So I'm going to turn the title around and say, rather than saying between realism and critical security studies, what is the continuing relevance of peace studies? My approach to this is, given the impressive growth, development and achievements of peace studies, what is the continued relevance of realism and critical security studies? So I hope I can put a reasonably convincing case together on that basis without sounding too big-headed from the point of view of Bradford, but it is a birthday and it is a 40th, and we are allowed to celebrate somewhat some aspects of our positive achievement. So I think Heidi said about she felt that the field hadn't moved on. I think it's moved on enormously from what it set out to do in the formative years, in the kind of mid-50s. It's not a very old, we can't even call it a discipline, but it's not a very old academic area of study. And I think in the 50 or 60 years in which we function, Bradford has been part of this. I'm going to conclude by saying there are, of course, areas and issues that we still have to attend to, and I think John Paul this morning pointed out to some very important parts of what these issues are. But let me just to give you three kind of areas where I think the impact has been dramatic and where perhaps we've not been confident enough or positive enough in claiming this distinctiveness. First of all, the test that Johan Galtung set, he wrote an essay sometime in the mid-1970s, and he said, I think Peter will probably even date this article, sitting at the back there, Peter van den Dungen. He said, does more peace studies mean more peace? That's the critical test. In other words, as the field has established itself, institutionalized itself, and come together as an academic area of study, has that meant there is more peace? And I'm going to say, I think it has, and it may have frailties because of some of the modalities in which it's operated, but generally I think, as I say, the impact has been positive. If we apply that test, the Galtung test, does more peace studies mean more peace? I think there are three areas where we can put a positive tick in the box. First of all is sheer numerical growth. I mean, when we set up in 74, I don't think there are more, perhaps 5. There were 5 or so peace studies centres worldwide that you could have identified as specifically working on the topic of the academic analysis of peace, the science of peace. We were one of them. Colgate, George Mason. There weren't many, and it for a long time it seemed to us that we weren't going to last that long. You know, that Bradford. A lot of people were amazed that we survived the first 4 or 5 years. 40 years on, we're celebrating a 40th birthday. And in that time, we've seen the field numerically expand enormously in terms of the number of centres. I don't know how many academic centres there are now, maybe 400 or 500. Peace research institutes, journals, recognised leading texts in the field. So there has been a dramatic, extraordinary numerical growth of what we can count as peace studies. So, okay, does that mean more peace? And this is where it gets a little bit more perhaps questionable, but I think there is evidence for impact of the field on practice on the ground in terms of policy, operational impact and so on. It's not just been an academic exercise, and it never set out to be. That the whole definition, the whole characteristic of peace science was this praxis dimension of it. So I think it's been extraordinarily effective in impacting on discourse, on language, on how we explain what peace studies is about, and introducing a whole new vocabulary about how we account for conflict, how we analyze it, how we understand its dynamics, how we convert that into preventive capabilities and so on. So I think that the term conflict prevention, which is now in normal parlance amongst policymakers, DFID, Foreign Office, MOD, we have, I think, a friend from MOD here is working on peacekeeping doctrine. A lot of this looks back to terminology which in the early years was purely academic. It was these terms were invented by people like Kenneth Boulding, who John Paul studied under. But at that point, they were just academic ideas. By the early 1990s, most national, regional, and international security organizations had conflict prevention policies. Okay, now so these are institutions of the state, of state and state systems, which are trying to practice conflict prevention. But at least they had these policies, and we can critique them and question how effective they've been, and are they manifestations of a hegemonic liberal peace, or what are they? But they're there, and they didn't exist as instrumental realities until peace studies, I think, defined, it wasn't only peace studies, but we had a very significant role in making that reality come about. So there's been a radical and dramatic change in the language of the policy community. Even, I think, the term peace building, I think, was invented by Johan Galtung. He introduced it into the discourse. And now, most international organizations, most national foreign policy departments are trying to define their peace-building policies. So we know these have their kind of templates, and they're not necessarily responsive to ground realities, but they're out there as strategic options to intervene in major conflicts and to transform them into a peaceful dynamic. John Burton gave us the term conflict resolution and problem solving. Adam Curl didn't invent mediation, but he was a pioneer of the citizens diplomacy, the second track. John Paul Lederach introduced conflict transformation. All of these terms in the discourse are recognized as new and innovative ways of understanding and explaining conflict and how to transform it into sustainable, non-violent peace-building processes. So I think the discourse has changed and the impact of this field. And this is a slightly bigger claim, but that discourse, I think, has had an operational impact 2 minutes. Okay, Neil, I'm sorry. Be very quickly. But summarize this very quickly. What's happened, I think, is that if you look at some of the data sets, I think, John Paul, you mentioned one at the Peace Accords Matrix at Notre Dame. There are many of these data sets out there which also didn't exist till the peace and conflict research community got their hands on data collection. Most of them, and we can question how accurate this is, show a decline in international armed conflict over the last 10 or 15 years. Most of them show that decline. Some of that decline, we can claim, is an effect of successful peace research, conflict resolution, and peace studies. So I think we should be, quietly pleased, not even quietly pleased. We should be proclaiming that achievement a little bit more than we have, while recognizing some of the limitations of where we want to go next. And I think with the one of the impacts of this conference, which the final plenary is on what is the future and the future challenges for peace studies, might put a little bit of light on that problem. But I don't think we should in any sense be facing retreat. We should be improving what we're already doing, and we should be trying to put in some of the, let's say, the soft power models, the curl type models, into those hard power institutions, which are already having an impact on mitigating violent conflict. So I've probably had my 10 minutes now, Neil. Thank you.
I think I took my 10 minutes this morning, so I won't go back to repeating some of the opening part of that, and we'll leave that as a contribution to this panel in part. So I'm going to focus on, unless I get distracted and start telling stories, in my 10 minutes, 3 things that I'd like to share. Both have a bit of a story to them, so I'll start with the first one. About 5 or 6 years ago in our faculty, we had a meeting of all the distinguished professors around a table, about 18 or 20 of us. Each of us was supposed to bring a proposal for the potential future of peace studies and what it would orient us toward doing. I brought 2 proposals, and both were thrown out of the room in laughter primarily, I think. One of them was that we should study Van Morrison more carefully. So I had to pursue that on my own, which came out in a recent book. I won't go in that direction today. The other I titled with a reference to Bob Dylan. You may notice I have a theme here between Morrison and Dylan. And it was called Watch the Rivers Flow. I proposed that it would be useful to have a 10 or possibly 20-year research project in which we would reorient ourselves away from state-centered research. And the river flows would be a kind of a giant Google map, and it would try to look at a number of things that do not correspond directly to internal civil war conflicts or international conflicts between nation states, but defy and go beyond the boundaries of the nation-state model. And so I outlined what I thought the rivers were. And the first one was actually a river, that is water. And that water would be among the things that will be at the source of much conflict in the decades, if not in the coming century. And that we would be wise to reorient ourselves to think beyond normal conflict and peace studies approaches to these things and really delve into this in a different way. But the river flows could also be about human movement, mobility. Trafficking on the one side, that is the trafficking of people. It's a very big phenomena. But it could also be about migratory and migration issues. And that we're living in a world that is not well suited and not well served by the current models that much of realism puts forward as the ways that we would think about those things. A third would be around the industry of the movement of weapons and guns. And if we look at the United States and Mexico, for example, we have a lot of issues with drug cartels. In Mexico, the sort of hidden, invisible side of that is that most of the weapons for that activity is produced in the United States. So the flow of, if you were able to follow it, the flow of guns defies a lot of what we typically look at. I had a fifth one, which was around sort of illicit trade in drugs. And I imagine there'd be more of these. My point was, it was not taken up by our institute, by the way, so, is that we have been far too bounded in our approaches to the notions that we have to define what we do according to existing models of nation-state formation and interaction. Some of my colleagues argue that I don't have a concept of the state. They're probably right. I actually, to some degree, behave as if it doesn't exist. Not that I don't interact with it, but I think it is an invention which does not always serve us well. And that many of the biggest challenges we have will require us to think differently than we have over the past century, going into the future. A second area, these are very, very diverse. How many minutes do I have left, Neil?
You've got a good 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I'm doing really good then. So the second was some things I alluded at this morning, but I'll describe it more in terms of a research initiative that I'm not sure yet where it's fully going. And it was to look across 5 different bodies of literature into the topics of compassion, creativity, and spirituality. And those 5 bodies of literature, with the exception of looking very specifically at peace-building literature, would range far beyond the normal places that we look around our conflict and peace studies activity. Neuroscience, contemplative traditions, the helping professions, and the artistic community. All of those communities have literature that focuses on those 3 themes. Now, in my own work, one of the things that I became increasingly convicted of is that the ability to move beyond the vicious cycles of violence required exactly what Einstein often said, which was that the logic that got you into something is not the logic by which you will be able to extricate yourself. And that it required forms of enormous creativity, sometimes in very unexpected ways. But we had not sufficiently understood or unpacked what creativity may require, how it functions, how it's introduced into the process of both practice and scholarship. So we started in on this. We have a small group that's kind of toying around. We convened people from these 5 traditions. This is a very intriguing discussion when you're sitting with, instead of sitting with your colleagues at peace studies conferences, you're sitting with somebody from a contemplative tradition right alongside a neuroscientist, alongside, a painter or a poet. And you have a different kind of conversation. And one of the things we discovered when we reviewed probably around 150 books, tried to annotate them from these 5 bodies, is that in particular, the field that touches the least on these topics, and in particular the field that touches the least on compassion, was peace building. There is very little written in peace building formally about compassion. I think it's because we all assume we're compassionate. That must be the reason why we study these things. But I don't think we actually mobilize around what that... so I'm just leaving this as kind of big picture things that for me, this would... so I don't situate peace studies between things. I think peace studies is at its best when it totally breaks the mold around which people are even thinking in. And that is part of where I think we have a challenge. We've come to accept too much the molds of what other people think in. The third area, which I now have about 1.5 minutes. Okay, this is going to be extremely short. I have 2 areas of my life that I can put in acronyms of PAM and PAR. And they are so radically different that they are complementary. They are so radically different that they fulfill each other in some intriguing forms. PAM is the Peace Accord Matrix, a formal data-based study of written peace agreements looking element by element across 10 years. And in a very big picture, one of the things it tells us is that peace agreements don't get implemented very well. And that they often have a lot of things that people suppose they will be able to do that they can't. And that they're often not about transitions, they're about deep transformations. And what's put on paper is not always accomplished. So it's very intriguing. PAR is participatory action research, which comes down to very grassroots level work with local communities. And these two worlds that I move in, I think are actually the two that may hold some real promise. That is being very careful about the ways we think about big structure systems, and very careful about the way that we engage with local communities over longer periods of time, and where they actually define and co-define the research agendas and become participants in creating the categories that are meaningful. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'll just start, or, okay. Yeah, thanks. So I think what I want to say is that peace studies was ahead of its time. And during the Cold War, when it was ahead of its time, it had quite a coherent and quite radical agenda. And it was clearly distinct from what we might heuristically call realism or strategic top-down problem solving from the point of view of states and elites, and quite distinct from a more abstract critical theorizing that you could do in ivory towers. And in my short 10 minutes, I want to say that even though peace studies hasn't changed, the rest of the world has, and that sort of has some fundamental implications and poses certain questions and problems. But it's the fact that peace studies and what it was doing seems more central and more important. That's like a positive side of the equation. So if we were thinking about peace studies and what it might mean, how peace studies worked in between problem solving from the point of view of securitizing elites and more abstract critical theorizing that doesn't really involve real people and the masses and all the rest of it, we might think of peace studies as inventing a more relational ontology and of thinking about bottom-up ways of engaging and giving critique a real engaged and inclusive and transformative and I guess critical in a very real sense position. And in doing that, and in doing that participatory critical research, there was a lot of discussion about the reflexivity and the growth of academic stroke activists involved in that and their interrelationship with the world. And I think in the Cold War of left and right and power relations and geopolitics, that stood out. It stood out so discreetly that peace studies had its separate institutes and all the rest of it. Now, fortunately and unfortunately, all those aspects of understanding relational, engaged, transformative ontologies seems to be more prevalent for reasons that even the experts aren't sure about. Is it because the world is more globalized and complex? Is it just because power doesn't work in its old ways and stuff? It seems that what we might call the realists, the strategic thinkers that were just going to put everything in stovepipes and impose stuff around the world and measure things by external universals, they seem to have slightly given up on that. They do not still, my provocative point, they do not really exist except for in our critical minds. And that when we think outside of peace studies, I don't know, when we look at development, human development is all the rage. Pluralized understandings of development. Development that can't be exported and imposed and measured. But human, transformative, empowering frameworks. And that the idea, of course, being that we cannot know and we cannot impose in traditional universalistic ways. And when you think about our colleagues that work in human rights work, they've also learned those similar lessons that people in peace studies already had, that human rights can't be about giving external frameworks of courts and lawyers and all the rest of it that people as victims would appeal to. A human rights-based approach now is very similar to a peace studies approach. It's about empowering and engaging and transforming communities because rights like development do not exist externally, outside of there, in some universalist fictiony world. And if we think about our colleagues that are interested in democratization, similarly, they would argue that it's not just about holding elections and all the rest of it, that there's not one universalistic framework. Again, it's about the transformative processes. It's about civil society, how civil society might work, not even just to hold politicians to account, but how civil society has a broader transformative content that has to be inclusive and engaging. And in all those cognate disciplines and policy approaches, there's been a sort of an inside out of the world, that the solutions are no longer things that experts and strategists can have and can impose. And I'd also argue that whatever we might think about critical theorists, they also have had a similar sort of crisis. And they are very critical of the top-down theorized, the Marxist idea of, the philosopher leading the poor, and, the revolutionary academic is going to tell the workers what to think, and their false consciousness and how they're mistaken. The humanist, what do they call it? Anyway, the suspicion of ordinary people that have been sort of sucked into these discursive stories and all the rest of it. They're even critical of the Foucauldians, because even for the Foucauldians, power always wins. Power always has the discourse. There seems to be no way out of it. And what I worry about is that the world is much more open to the idea that there's no division between the universal and the particular, the inside and the outside, that we have to really rethink our traditional modernist and linear and reductionist understandings of how policy works and how critique might work and how the world might work. So in peace studies becoming, or the ontology of peace studies becoming more accepted, it means that there's a lot more competitors. It means it's not so clear what the institution of peace studies might be. It's not so clear what the normative or ethical standpoint that keeps a peace studies practitioner, activist, academic separate from other people in the world. And I think that I agree with Heidi's point that peace studies hasn't really changed. And I think that there's also been a view that the world maybe hasn't changed, a view that critical theorizing is still what it used to be in the 70s and we shouldn't be touching it, and that policy making is still as Machiavellian and geopolitical and strategic, and we don't want to get too closely involved in that. And I think that rather than peace studies being the future of the world, there's a danger that peace studies might become left behind in the transformation of the world, in the transformation of the training and the thinking of policymakers and policy advisors, and also the transformation in what goes for critical, intellectual, philosophical thoughts today. And possibly 3 points that we might come out of it that we would need to think in order to give peace studies the position that it deserves to have at the forefront rather than lagging is, in fact, I think, a greater openness to the world. And as Jean-Paul was saying earlier today, the ability to listen and engage with policymakers and with critical academics and get out of that bubble a little bit. And in doing that, we'd have to rethink what peace studies was. And I guess one of the problems is a certain hangovers, a certain universalistic telos of peace as an end or a goal. It seems a little bit clunky in the world today, and something that actually would go against the essence of a lot of the tradition of peace studies, that there's some finality, some end point, that the world sort of stops. And it begins to sound a little bit like a strategic solution or some sort of the science of academic critique, that we're just going to overthrow capitalism and have some vanguard or something. That there's something a little bit wrong with that. And it also says there's something a bit mechanistic as well, that these societies where there's a lack of peace have a problem that can be resolved where we return to some equilibrium. In our world of fluidity, transformation, change, peace seems to be slightly clunky like that, if we understand it as the goal we've all signed up to, rather than an engaged process that actually doesn't come to an end. And I think the second point might be a slightly, what we call a reductionist understanding of peace, that peace is somehow discrete and separate. And in some of our panels today, and in some of our academic discussions, we've been talking about the infrastructures for peace, or how we might do certain policy, security sector reforms for peace. And it's quite clear that in a more fluid, relational world, that sort of thinking doesn't really work. And as our colleagues that work in development democracy and human rights are saying that actually they need to think about how things relate to each other, how there's an entanglement of different aspects, how the essence of what they're doing in their transformative, people-centered understanding is that there isn't a discrete policy area where there's policies for peace that are somehow policies not for human rights, not for equality, not for gender justice, etc. And to sort of be trapped in a past framework where we think that there is a set of problems and solutions which happen to be neatly labelled as peace, I think would be problematic. And just in my last minute, and maybe the slightly more awkward thing, is that there's a slight normative bent towards our understanding of being engaged practitioner academics and being concerned with peace, as if that a relational ontology, an ontology of care and engagement and transformation is somehow an ethical or normative thing that makes us good people. And I think that, unlike Heidi's position, that if we are to ignore a more critical theoretical positions of new materialism, of a more ontological new materialist turn, we're going to miss an opportunity of saying, actually, this isn't a moral choice. We're not doing this because we're better people than you are, but the world actually is fluid and entangled and relational. We do not stand separate from it and interfere as separate experts or interfere or intervene because we're morally better. That actually, in a world that's continuing to change, we have to rethink what we understand as knowledge and how we understand power and policy working, but that's not a moral choice, that's actually a policy necessity. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'd like to start by saying congratulations to Bradford, this amazing 40-year-long network of people studying peace studies, peace and conflict issues, fanning out around the world now, and I think really making a difference to the way in which people across many disciplines understand the place and positionality of conflict in very different forms, in our institutions, in our politics, in our production of knowledge, and so forth. It's an amazing achievement. That's not to be too self-congratulatory, though, because I also find myself in a position, the unlikely position, of following David Chandler and agreeing with quite a lot of what he says, although perhaps my emphasis would be slightly different and slightly more positive in some ways. But let me just start by making a couple of statements related to the title that we've been given to speak to. I mean, I think that although it sounds unfeasible, this thing called progress is back on the international and intellectual agenda. I think realism has been dispatched, and critical security studies, well, where is it? It's gone the way of the English school and the Aberystwyth school and all the rest of it. And for the moment, we in a kind of interregnum. There's a lacuna, there's a transitional moment in which the old world seems to be passing, and we are, of course, in a position of not really knowing what happens next, and being both the victim of the old world and the victim of the thing that we don't know about that's coming in the future. And I think that's felt very strongly in the policy world. And that's the interesting thing about this 40 years. In those 40 years, we have built, not we personally, but there has emerged an enormous peace architecture, the international exoskeleton of peace and development, which covers a whole range of material, legal, political, institutional, and so on issues and frameworks which were and have been deemed to be part of our experience of conflict during that period. And to that has been added recently this discussion about peace infrastructure, in other words, the idea of what comes from the social that has experienced conflict, and what it does, how it engages with the external world, the external peace architecture, and how it produces its own institutions, its own understandings of culture and identity and rights, the state and the international in our terms. I think this kind of interregnum, where we're seeing this encounter take place, and we don't know which way it's going to go, is felt quite it's felt broadly, not just in peace and conflict studies, but also in international relations. If you look at some of the latest publications, the special issue of EJIR and so on, I mean, people are talking about, can we go back to grand theory? Do we need mid-level theories? Are there any theories that work anymore? Do we just need to do comparative stuff on empirical facts, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a moment, there's a space, and I think we have to, as peace studies has been good at in the past, grab that moment and galvanize a debate, renew it again. And that's how I understand this conference, as being part of that attempt, and I think it's very timely and much needed. So this is what I think. I think that we are now in a position where we can look back at the last 25 years, that's a quarter of a century, of formalized interventionary practices, from the legal terrain, the political, the military, to the social, which has been designed to deal with some ways in which we have understood conflict. Some of them draw on 19th century thinking about the territorial sovereign state. Some of them draw on 18th century thinking about the merits of liberalism. Some of them draw on mid-20th century understandings of modernization and social progress. And these are all old models which were designed for those older worlds, which are now passing, I think, in many ways. And what we saw in the last 25 years was the culmination of a very complex system, bring all of those historical moments and patterns and tools together into a peace architecture, which has run right through the international system, from the development actors to the UN system, to the IFIs, to the INGOs, down to the NGOs and civil society actors, and all the rest of it. And this, has led to a very complex and mixed process. Much of it has been highly interventionary. Much of it has been very contradictory. Indeed, some of it has normalized the conflict landscape of the world that we live in. Even though we are scholars of peace and conflict, we can still look around the world and accept that there are certain naturalized conflicts out there which we don't get involved in, or we can't for geopolitical or strategic reasons, as well as there being conflicts which we can get involved in for other reasons. So there's all of these sorts of inconsistencies. And that quarter of a century has produced a kind of legitimacy gap, because these inconsistencies don't go unnoticed. It's not just critical scholars who notice these things. And in fact, we take our cue from the people we talk to, the people we engage with, the data we look at. And I think that, well, certainly in my experience, I learnt about these things from other people who were actually experiencing them, because I've never experienced them myself. So this legitimacy gap suggests that this attempt to create a kind of coordinated peace architecture in the last 25 years, using the scientific knowledge that we have about peace and conflict, also bringing it together awkwardly and uncomfortably with the political interests of the powerful, and also bring it together with the leftovers of the military, political, and economic structures of those past worlds, in order to produce things like peacekeeping, later peace building, and so forth. Have produced these sorts of contradictions, where there is a claim for democracy, there's a claim for rights, there's a claim for legitimacy. Intervention is the mechanism, it's the method by which you get in to do these sorts of things. But the end result, looking across that time period, has been very mixed. Many people argue there have been significant gains. Many people argue there's been a loss of legitimacy. What we see today is there are now large swathes of the world where there is little externalized peacekeeping, peace building, development, intervention, humanitarian intervention taking place, and nor will it be able to take place under these current structures. And I think that is the big challenge that we now face. And, in this age of potential progress, I think the policymakers are way ahead of us, because they're already thinking about the political, the military, the infrastructural connotations of not having access to various regions of the world which are in danger of destabilizing the models that we have, the legitimacy that we've built up, the historical experience that we have of peace development, institutions, rights law, and all the rest of it. So in the institutions like the UN, the World Bank, DPKO, UNDP, and so on, people are actually already having these conversations. Look, to put it crudely, we blew the last 25 years. And we lost legitimacy, we lost access, we lost the argument. Now, how do we remake an argument which is attractive? This is the lacuna, this is the gap. How do we attract the subjects of intervention into the interventionary process? Is it possible to do it in some conflicts in certain places, but not in others? Is there not a legitimacy question? How do we do it with very limited resources? What is its normative basis? How do we claim universality in a world of diversity, etc., etc.? Two possible answers to this question. We supply them with a new progressive understanding of peace and development, which makes it very clear that you cannot do disconnected intervention, peace-building development in certain ways in one place but not in another. That there cannot be inconsistencies in a world in which information flows freely in this entangled and complex world. Or we let them go down the path of least resistance, which is actually the path of most resistance and the one that they often want to go down, which is to move from the age of intervention into the age of trusteeship. And the age of trusteeship automatically, which is the one that they're heading for, will become an age of, and I use these terms advisedly, native administration. So what we're faced with in today's world is 25 years of very limited success in those interventions, which claim to be based on humanitarian, human rights and democratic rights frameworks. This age of intervention, which was self-justifying according to a Eurocentric small community of thinkers and actors and so on, is going to be very easily translated into an age of native administration where you establish compliant but not very pleasant governments who will play ball with you within those parameters. I think this is what we see happening. Of course, in parallel, what's also happening is an age of resistance, much noted around the world. This is indicative of a deadlock. Let's call it a new type of conflict. Let's call it structural conflict, or even structural war. This isn't new war, even. This is a world in which there are real structural issues which now need to be addressed if the legitimacy of the international architecture, which is historically built up, is to be added to, because I'm not sure we can actually maintain it. So it's time to reconsider those things. I think, and this is my own personal view, and I know many people disagree, the only way that structural change can come about is through the eyes of the subjects or the victims of the systems themselves. So this cannot be an age of trusteeship, and it cannot be an age of native administration that we move into as part of the new progressive peace. It has to be a world which is defined by those who have suffered those structural types of conflict and violence. So to do this, we need to look at the way in which the international, the state, the rights frameworks, the arms trade, the global economy, and so on, naturalize structural violence. The way they make it seem to be normal, that we live in this world of great inequality and so forth. I think that across the literatures that discuss the last 25 years and more, there are lots of signs of where we could go with this as a peace and conflict studies community. We had a long debate about distributive justice. Inequality is back on the agenda. We've had a long debate about pluralism in identity terms. Heterotopia is perhaps back on the agenda. We've had a long debate about whether the form of democratic politics that we propose in the Eurocentric North, the liberal peace system itself, can work without material forms of equality at the global and the local level. We have concepts of equilibrity. In other words, it's time now to start thinking about the signs, the concepts, the evidence, putting it all together as the peace studies community's long been pretty good at, I think, and coming up with a new perspective and a new framework for dealing with these sorts of issues. And I'll stop there, because otherwise I get told off.
Okay, well, as you may have gathered, one of the sort of instructions that I gave to all the panel members was to be provocative, and I think they certainly followed that instruction to the letter. I think they've, between them, they've given us a whole series of points and issues to reflect on, and so I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions from the floor, so if we can start taking them. I'll take 2 or 3 and then go back to the panel. So, over there.
Thank you very much. My name's Rachel Julian from Leeds Metropolitan University. My mind's spinning a bit, I'm a bit overwhelmed by it all, but I was wondering if panellists somehow between you could comment on non-violence and non-violence theory and non-violence resistance as obviously sort of like part of the challenge for peace studies and the way in which we create a just and peaceful world. Thanks.
Okay, and there's somebody over there.
My question says, how peace studies plan to defeat national interest?
And then somebody in the front here.
Hi, question to Professor Lederach. I wonder what was the final decision of the panel? Which project did they decide to pursue?
Oh, and then one more there from the back, and one more there, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thanks. Owen Green. Thanks to the panel. I didn't expect to find myself agreeing with 90% of everything that was said, but I did in the end. And I think my question is, okay, so this has been very rich, and in some way there's a very common theme, which is peace studies is a multidisciplinary space in which a whole range of agendas can move forward, and its future shouldn't be framed in terms of between the realism and so on. And I buy that. I suppose my question is, next steps, because we have maybe 20 different particular themes, all of which link together. To what extent is it important that peace studies resolves discussions about some of these priorities, as opposed to simply a space within which there's a dialogue about those, but each individually pursuing their agendas within this sort of wide common framework?
Okay, and then a final question just down here.
Thank you. Could I go back 42 years, not 40 years, and raise a rather tangential issue here? When peace studies was first proposed at Bradford University, which was a new technical university, the Vice-Chancellor, the first Vice-Chancellor, Ted Edwards, who was known locally as Red Ted, felt that peace studies would form a base of the whole university. It would set values for the whole university. And not only would it study peace studies, but it would actually bring peace studies to every department to form a value base of every department in the university, in engineering, in management, and all the other departments. Now, has that been achieved, or is that a way forward for the future that perhaps hasn't been considered?
Okay, perhaps if we just go down the panel and respond to the various questions.
Yes, firstly, Rachel, your point, what about non-violence? I think your question sets me up nicely for what I was going to conclude in my 10-minute presentation, except Neil oppressively and cruelly cut me off at the knees. So, because one of the, and I think to continue the provocations in response to David, and I don't think, well, the term peace is elastic and probably has been appropriated and the world has moved on. But I think, and we've talked a lot about transitions and redefinition, how do we need to move on with it? So for me, the question is contesting that definition and making it dynamic and real and relevant. And my point was going to be that non-violence and the traditions of pacifism have always been, sometimes they've been, not everybody is a non-violent pacifist in peace studies, but it's a strong part of the ethos, and it's a strong part, and many would say it should be a stronger part of what we study. And I know that you fly the flag for that very well. So I think that the role of non-violence in the agendas of peace studies, both as pedagogy, teaching, and research, needs to be strengthened. It does make us distinctive. I think other philosophy and so on, other areas do, but for us in this field, that is a core value. And going back to Quakers, to the last question, that's the reason QBST wanted peace studies to be at Bradford because they wanted an academic discipline that would understand how non-violent practices were studied and implemented in practice in the real world. On that question, so I think that we need to continue to claim the value of the term. Because I think in all the academic disciplines or areas of study, we are the ones that claim to construct knowledge around peace. We have to reinvent that and strengthen the non-violent core to it, I think. On the 42 years in Red Ted was so passionate about peace studies that when he retired as Vice Chancellor, he insisted on having an office in the Peace Studies Department, which is a nice move. Clearly, the values haven't pervaded all the departments, and I don't think ever realistically they could. And departments are still silos and segregated, and it's hard to make those crossovers. But I still think that people know within the university and without that Bradford is identified primarily as a place which has peace studies. And I think we haven't, the curriculum, the crossovers haven't developed that strongly. But there is an awareness that there is a presence of peace studies here, and perhaps that's something else in terms of reinventing ourselves that we should be working on. So I think, again, in terms of playing around with the title, why war, we should be redefining the questions. Why is there peace? In other words, we should be looking at what make peace structures and peace cultures more durable, and non-violence would be a part of that. Fadi's question I can't answer, it's just to John Paul. Owen, next steps. I think next steps for me would be, I think in terms of the transition, I think peace studies departments, including Bradford, need to rethink the curricula quite radically, because when it was put in place by Adam Curl and succeeding professors, it has become a little bit, because the academic kind of machine wants it to be like that, has become a little bit creaky. I forget, clunky was David's term. And so I think a fairly imaginative rethinking of the curriculum, which involve the student voice and perhaps cross-departmental interdisciplinary work within the university is a way of doing that. So that would be next steps for me, and I probably said more than enough, so I'll pass the mic on.
Just very quickly, can I just pick up perhaps on one of the comments about the place of peace studies in the university, and just speak to that more generally. I think that one of the problems that we face in British universities is that we're all under a huge amount of pressure to engage with the national interest. This is in an era when, frankly, nationalism should be illegal, and yet it seems to be coming back. And our work and our objectives are being framed, and they still are framed in terms of taxation and these sorts of things by the state, not necessarily the nation state. And we should be pushing against that very hard. It's very hard for us not to be kind of complicit with the neoliberal ethos of the modern institution, if that's a kind of a coherent statement, which it isn't, but they don't know that. But on the other hand, I think we can at least, as good critical scholars should always do, keep pushing back against these sorts of, let's say, authoritarian management tendencies, the rule of experts, anti-democratic, anti-rights oriented, only focused on the bottom line and all of those sorts of things. Now, peace studies has done that symbolically in the area of conflict and structural violence extremely well, and I think we should be practicing it institutionally inside our universities as well as across our universities too. We shouldn't be giving these administrators such an easy ride to tell us how we should behave and spend our day when we are very focused on teaching and research, and we know how to do it. Anyway, that's my own little gripe at the moment. Apologies for that.
So maybe there's a couple of quick questions I can answer. I don't know, is it Freddie? I assume you were meaning the discussion we were having at our Kroc Institute, or did you mean this panel? No, Kroc Institute panel. Well, the outcome of that was to focus on the term strategic peace building, for which a volume was produced among the set of professors that have participated in it. Interesting, but a little less than satisfactory, but it's about as far as you can get any group of 15 professors to agree to anything. It's a miracle. So, and one of the things we found rather commonly in my experience is it's very difficult actually for departments of peace studies to develop cohesive volumes together. We are a disparate set of people, and we tend to have our own forms of viewing territory, so it's not always easy to create sort of wider organizing themes where that happens. On the nonviolence, I will say one piece, since I'm always advocating the transformational agenda, that one of the things, I come out of a tradition that comes from nonviolence and pacifism, out of a personal trajectory. And I think one of the most shocking things that I found early on in my work in Latin America in particular was a deep suspicion that terminology that I would have thought was easily taken for the good was taken for the unspoken undercurrents that came with it that were actually hegemonic and imperial, of which our field is we need to include ourselves in that. And the question that formed that, which you've read probably in one or two of my books, if you've noticed the ways that I frame some of this, is that people were suspicious that you would be able to solve problems or resolve conflicts and not change anything. That is, that the work is actually some form of getting rid of the open exterior expression of it, but not actually engage in the deeper transformational processes. And when I started to look more carefully at that, it became clear to me that, among other things, it certainly would be possible to have entire focus on conflict resolution and peace studies with little attention to nonviolence, because nonviolence actually posits at its core the mobilization of people to change things that have been deep-seated patterns. And that actually creates more conflict. And so in the resolutionary approach in particular, so much of the methodology aims at de-escalation and has very little space for the notions of how we actually mobilize around changes that are needed and don't come easily. And for me, the transformational agenda had an ability to hold both of those. That is, that you can look at how you de-escalate away, particularly from violence, but that you can be very much mobilized around deep-seated social change and political agendas in ways that escalate conflict nonviolently. And I think that's where a lot of our challenge really sits to a large degree. On the question, I'll have a very quick answer to the question of peace studies, how it will defeat national interests. I propose that Tom Woodhouse arrange a soccer match. This time not between peace studies and war studies, but between peace studies and national interest, and have a go at it. Apparently the last thrashing was 3-0, so maybe the next time through would be the same. No, this actually comes very close to the point that I was trying to make, that to the degree we organize the category within which we must think as the nation state, we inevitably will always be faced with the idea that we're not a global human family. And the structures that we've created inherently will hold elements that don't permit us to get at some of our deepest and most perplexing issues that face us, not as an individual nation, but as a whole family, a whole globe. And I think that's is a very, very big question, actually. That's part of what I was trying to aim at.
So I think that there's, my points suggest all the same point about what would it mean to do peace studies today in a relational ontology, which would be peace studies doesn't do things. Peace studies doesn't fight national interests or something. By doing peace studies, by thinking in relational ontologies, other things become possible, would be the general ethos of a peace studies approach. And that makes us think about what does it mean to think about the values of peace studies, and the idea of those values can't be given to other disciplines would be a fairly old-fashioned way of thinking about it. What we think about is how other disciplines today seem to develop relational ontologies that we're learning about or previously learnt about when we think about computer sciences, natural sciences, anthropology, sociology, anything else. they are going through a certain transformation which enables them to rethink how they understand causality, human nature, division, subject, object, all those philosophical things that are not somehow alien to us, because even in our philosophical understandings of the world, there's a certain challenge to a sort of linear, rationalist view, the sort of view that says peace, we can impose it. Peace is about securing, it's about finality. So if you're thinking about developing peace studies as the study of a relational ontology, peace studies cannot be a separate discipline to the study of the world in a relational way. Now, fortunately, every other discipline is doing that. And that's why I sort of said it's a bit clunky in peace studies, because there's an assumption, as Heidi said, that why do we need to be critical? Because we're already critical because we are. But actually, in fact, it takes work. It's a process. As Jean-Paul was saying, it's a process where you understand that work on yourself and work on the world are related and they're not separate. And so knowledge production and engagement, they're also not separate either.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've got time for another round of questions. I can see Paul at the back there.
Paul Rogers from Bradford. I won't comment on the issues of the future of peace studies. We have a panel on that later. But just to come back to Rachel's point on the non-violent side, I think we're very bad at actually speaking up for what has happened. You can cite 5 major movements of the last 100 years. Suffrage, decolonization following the failure of Britain to be able to hold on to India, the civil rights movement, the changes in Eastern Europe in 1989-90 and the citizen action, and more recently what's happening in the Middle East, which, as Saib said, is the start of a 2-decade process. You can deconstruct all of those in terms of the other factors with suffrage, with decolonization, the civil rights movement with black power behind it, etc., etc. But we tend basically to underestimate the significance of non-violent change that has already taken place. And I think we do ourselves an injustice in doing that.
And somebody, the 2 people down here.
I would just like to, John Gittings, I'd just like to comment that I haven't heard the word Ukraine mentioned yet. And I think we should be wary of jettisoning the whole of the old Cold War peace studies approach. We have a reviving Cold War between the United States and Russia. We have a potential new Cold War between the United States and China in the Pacific. One hears realist arguments all the time ad in the media over the Ukraine and the confrontation there. And I think we still have something of an old-fashioned job to do.
I've been to the 2 workshops this morning talking about emotional issues, and I realise that I'm getting quite shocked and irritated, whilst also being intellectually challenged and stimulated. David Chandler particularly, you've mentioned humanistic, holistic, transformative, fluid, relational ontologies and processes, without ever mentioning the role, perhaps, in the last 40 or 50 years of feminist movements. And I realised I was getting irritated when I looked at the table there. Now, I know Heidi was here and she's gone. And then I had my hand up, actually, I think almost first, and the 2 gentlemen immediately behind me were asked to speak. Have you anything to say about that?
The guy there.
Thanks. Simon Whitby from Peace Studies. Roger Wilson, a Quaker academic, commented when there was discussion taking place about peace studies should be, does it belong in a university? Can you study peace? All the rest of it. Expressed a number of concerns. One of them was that universities in the business of the knowledge industry, and he was worried that if, because of course Quakers are interested in making a difference and doing things. And he was worried that, peace studies would become this kind of, enterprise that would specialize, and it would lose sight of, things that make, mean things to people in the real world, like violence and conflict and so on and so forth. So he made an analogy with health, and the study of health in universities, and he said, well, look at what happens. You get specialization, and the common cold gets ignored, the common cold being war and violence and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering, in a way this is kind of directed at Neil and David Chandler, because I think, David has laid down, I think, something about, an indictment of critical security studies in an article recently, where he argues that it's lost its emancipatory sort of edge, and the second and third generation of critical security studies scholars have kind of lost the plot in the sense that they've lost sight of emancipation, security, community emancipation being, one of the sort of driving forces of the analysis. And in a theoretical sense, they've lost sight of emancipation, and in a practical sense, then, critical security studies failed to deliver, in terms of being empirically testable and and relevant to the real world. So failed in theoretical conceptual terms, failed in practical terms. But in some ways, I think David Chandler's critique seems to me to at least sort of lay down the gauntlet where, critical security studies, if there's a Bradford sort of brand of that is concerned. And it really requires a response that takes on board, and really gains sight of the importance of emancipation, but also of power, also of post-colonial critiques of critical security studies, but also reflecting the concerns of the lady in front. Gendered critiques, which seem to me to be part and parcel of a reconceptualization of critical security studies that could be a Bradford school. We've got a Welsh school, we've got a Copenhagen school, we've got a Manchester school. Where's the Bradford school? And so in some ways, this may go, and the other point, I suppose, about that is that reconceptualization is required. But it has to be, empirically testable. It has to be relevant to what's going on in the real world. And in some ways, this might, speak to Wilson's concerns that universities are, the places in, where knowledge takes place. It's part of an industry, and there's a tendency to specialize and to lose sight of the real world. So what I'm arguing for is, in some ways, a response to David Chandler. And I realise many of you have not read his article, but a response to David Chandler that's both theoretically, conceptually, sort of rethought, but is also of relevance to power and to gender and to post-colonial critiques, but is also empirically testable, and is also of relevance to the real world.
Okay, I'm aware that there are lots of other hands going up, but we're approaching time-out period. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the questions there and just ask the panel to respond in about a minute each, very, very quickly. Not necessarily to all of the points, but the ones that they feel they want to do. Tom, do you want to go first?
Yeah. If it's a minute, well. Paul, yes, I think you echoed my claim that some of the positive achievements we don't air them enough. We don't claim enough credit. John, on Ukraine, I think it is old-fashioned job to do, and I think some of the methodologies of the old-fashioned model are appropriate ones. Problem-solving workshops, more communication between the two sides. That these processes can be energized, and I don't have any knowledge in that area, but I know, for example, John Russell, one of our professors, very much does. So we would like to see more of that strategy being resourced, really. I think perhaps a lot of the, I'm not passing the buck, but maybe there's some space for David to reply to Simon and our friend on the issues of feminist representation, but someone else can take that one on.
Yeah, and just very quickly to add, I mean, I think the argument that history is a story of social movements claiming rights successfully and changing the way in which institutions and law operates is one which is understandably written out of history by power because it's not convenient, but it is an important part, a very significant part, and I think peace studies has kept that story alive. And I think the claims that are being made against the system, both this structure, this kind of backbone of the international system that we have, but also the conventions by which most of us live our lives, currently, in many places around the world, are bringing that back to the fore. The question is, what happens? What does it lead to? What sort of institutions? What sort of reforms to law? How do we change our behaviour? And so on. And that's why I think I'm quite interested in this idea of what a progressive peace would look like now, after all of these experiences. Reading the signals that are coming from within those different movements today. On the gender question, I'd like to connect that to broader representational issues. I mean, we've been talking for at least 20 years about the fact not just that gender is a problem, but when we're talking about peace and conflict, there is also a north-south power relation quite often. And we've been saying, and where are the subjects? Why aren't they here in the room to tell us what they think? And there's quite a few here, and it has improved, but you know, there's still a symbolic representation of global historical power relations and injustices, not just relating to the gender question, but also to north-south distributive justice and so on. There's a lot of things we just can't mention, which we could do with mentioning, because what's happening today is a broadening of the pool of representation in the world and in politics, which is changing the way in which we see the world. It's also constraining the understanding of power that we once in the West thought we had. And I think we should be leaving a legacy which we will be proud of and which we can defend, so that when other powers, other forms of power pop up and say, this is the way things are going to be, we won't be afraid. And that's not something we've been very good at in the last 25 years. That's my point about our legacy. We had many opportunities to do all kinds of things, development, gender, security, human security, Millennium Development Goals, the 2015 Millennium Development Goals. Look at the record. It's touch and go. Are we proud of it?
I don't have a whole lot to add. I think the one of the pieces that's for me been really instructive the last few years, partly because I have a daughter that I'm co-authored with and who was far more versant in feminist literature than I was, to come to the point you were making. She said to me one day, I was just on a panel with Cynthia Enloe. I don't know if any of you are reading some of the work that she's done historically, which I think is very, very powerful. And I told Cynthia, as we started the panel, I had a personal story to recount, which was that my daughter at one point told me, "Dad, I think that you're a feminist." And I said, my gosh, I'd never even thought about such a thing, because it was a whole new way for me to conceptualize things that had been done from essentially a viewpoint that was asking the questions of deeper, more radical forms of inclusion and deeper, more radical forms of viewing the personal and the political. And I have been incorporating a lot more of that literature into the classes that I've been doing and engaging it more directly with students, which I think is a big piece of the puzzle. The question, I think, at a bigger level that maybe symbolized what you were finding irritating was how do we actually create the spaces where those things are not considered to be at the periphery but more at the center? And I think that's really been the challenge that I've seen in peace studies itself. And I think it's driven in part because we accept too much of the categories within which we're trying to get people to view us as legitimate. And because we want to be considered legitimate in the eyes of the existing categories, we actually place at the periphery the things that we should be bringing into the center. And that's at least one way of coming at that question.
Thank you. So many questions. The Ukraine thing, I don't think that Cold War and realism and geopolitics are coming back, but obviously we see the world through the lenses that we see the world through, and there's a lot of debate about that. And I think it's really interesting to see how that works. And I think that there's a lot of wishful thinking that the world is just going to go back and we'll be over this blip and we'll be back to power and peace studies and everything's going to be okay. I don't think that's going to happen myself. And in terms of representational understanding and empirical testing, I also think that's a little bit backward looking. The idea that we have policies that we just impose on the world and then we test them later would seem to be behind most policy thinking, where the idea is that policy has to be responsive, it has to be a feedback loop, and the idea that we separate ourselves off from the world and impose this thing and then wait for ages wouldn't really seem to work. And I think John Paul's work has has for a long time really indicated that, and you're not isolated in that argument as far as I can see. Empirical testing can't work in that sort of way. Empirical testing is the engagement with people and that process, and the more we begin to overcome that separation of governing and governed, the better policy might be.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're out of time. I'd just like to say that when I came into this panel, I think I would have probably shared the more pessimistic outlook of David and Heidi about that idea that peace studies hasn't really intellectually moved on. Now, I think to some extent, some of the other contributions have confirmed me that maybe I was wrong at the outset, but to the extent... But to the extent that I still do have concerns, I think one of the things that we can say is that this has been a stepping stone, a staging post in reinvigorating that process, that continuous process of reinvigorating peace studies. And then finally, just to say that the next stage in that process, as indicated by Paul, will be the final plenary session that will be closing the conference, that will consist of Paul, Caroline Hughes and Jenny Pierce. So that will be a continuation of this conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you.